Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me. My name is Tom. I'm an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo, and today we are going to be talking about the states of matter. Now, this is a really cool topic in and of itself, but today we're not only going to be talking about what the different states of matter are, but we are also going to be talking about how they are important to different environments, or to different ecosystems and even animals that are found within different environments. So I'm going to introduce what these different states of matter are, and we're really going to primarily focus on three. And then we are going to talk about how they are different from each other, and then we are going to talk about how there can actually be a change from one state of matter to another when energy is added or removed. And I think this is a really cool take on this topic. And we're even going to apply how changes in the states of matter based on energy and conditions is going to be important for different environments. So we're kind of going to get really deep into it, but I hope you find it all as interesting as I do. And let's dive into it, shall we? So I'm going to share my screen with everybody because I think this PowerPoint will make it a little bit easier to understand and follow. Let me see. Okay, so when we are thinking about our states of matter, we are referring to, oh, I guess we should define what matter really even is, right? So matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. And when we think about matter itself, it's anything that's made up of little atoms that then therefore form or combine to form molecules. And those molecules are what we kind of think about as our building blocks for everything around us. So again, really, it's just anything that has mass and takes up space. But with that being said, that's a broad overview of matter, and there are different states of matter, which is what we are talking about today. And so what we can talk about is the differences between these states of matter, and the three I'm going to focus on are solids, liquids, and gases. There's also plasma, but we're not going to focus on that one today. Then there's also a fifth state of matter, which is man-made, but we will not focus on that either. So we can kind of differentiate between solids, liquids, and gases. So we can think about it in two different ways, their arrangement or their behavior. So all of these states of matter are made up of little particles, right? I said again, they're made up of atoms that form molecules, but we're just gonna talk about their particles. And so a solid is, those particles are not separated. They're all packed together, even touching each other and intertwined. And they have a normal arrangement. So it's not a random way in which they are all combined or packed together. It's packed together in an arrangement or a pattern, you can kind of think of it as. So a consistent pattern throughout the way it's packed. Whereas a liquid, the particles are separated and they can be moving past each other, and there's no arrangement. This is random. And then with gases, those particles are very separated. And again, because they're very separated, they're not arranged in any way. And then we can think about behavior, and it's kind of very similar to what we just talked about with their arrangement. So again, with solids, since they are packed together and formed in a pattern, they don't really just free float, right? They stick together, and so the most movement you can get out of, I have behavior here, but really we're talking about movement. So the most movement they have is that the particles that are combined or connected, they can vibrate at high speeds, but they're not ever going to separate or move past one another or be free floating or anything like that. Whereas with a liquid, particles, they still vibrate, but they can also slide past each other, and in a free manner. So there's no real, again, right, there's no shape or arrangement. So they can freely slide past each other in any way they would like. And then in, oops, I have solid listed again, but at the bottom it should be gas. And Oh, actually, the top one should be gas, my mistake. And that's one that says particles vibrate and move at high speeds, right? So that's because those particles are not attached at all. They are free floating and they can be going wherever they want, and they can be moving at high speeds. Okay, now there's one other thing that we can kind of think about when we're differentiating these three different states of matter, and that is kind of what kind of shape they take on. So a solid, right, has a defined shape, and it will not take on the shape of a container that you put it in or anything like that. It's not going to conform to any shape. So kind of think about putting a marble in a bowl. That marble is a solid. It's not going to form to the bottom of the bowl or spread out. It's a solid, so it's going to retain its own shape. And because of that, and when thinking about all the particles in a solid being tightly packed together, there's not a lot of space in between those particles, right? So it's not going to be easy to change the shape of that solid either, because there's not a whole lot of space to condense anymore. So once a solid is in its shape, unless you apply a certain kind of pressure, that solid is going to retain its shape pretty well. Okay, we can think about liquids. Liquids will take the shape of a container or a space that it's found in, right? And that's because, you know, those particles are free moving. There is more space in between the particles. And so a liquid will fill the space of whatever it's found in. And there is still, though, not a lot of room to compress liquids. So if you think about it, once a liquid fills a container, you can't really just push liquid down and fit more liquid into something, right? It's going to just overflow at that point if you want to think about it that way, right? So you can't, just like a solid, it's difficult to really compress a liquid because those particles are still together, but they're free moving. So while it can move around, you know, there's still not a whole lot of potential to compress that state of matter. Now, a gas, there is lots of space in between the particles because they're not connected and they are free floating and moving all over the place, right? So, you know, there is a lot of potential to compress and fit even more and more gas into a space and a container, and that can vary how much you can fit. So I hope that gives a pretty good understanding of the differences between our different states of matter. That's just talking about them in general to provide a general overview and basis of them. But what I find even more interesting is thinking about how one state of matter can transition or kind of change physically into another state of matter. And so this can happen when energy is applied. So when thinking about energy that is applied, what do we think about? What is a type of energy that could really cause one state of matter to change into another? It's usually something like thermal energy or heat. So we can think about a number of different processes. We can think about when heat is applied, we can have vaporization, which is the change from a liquid to a gas. So when that heat or that thermal energy is applied, liquids can change to gases through two different processes, through boiling. So when that liquid reaches a boiling point, things are going to escape as a gas. So that's why we see things like steam coming off of boiling water, right? Some of that liquid is changing into a gas and it's moving out of that liquid form into the air, right? That's why if you boiled a pot of water forever, you would lose all of it. That water would disappear, right? It would all turn into a gas and disappear out of that pot. But we can also lose liquid to a gas through a process known as evaporation. And so evaporation is a pretty cool process. It's a very important one. It's one that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, especially related to animals and environments. But essentially, it's this idea that when liquids are colliding and smashing into each other, they're transferring energy. And if enough liquid particles or molecules collide into each other close enough to the surface of that liquid, they can start to collide and to the point where they will lose their form and be ejected kind of out into the air. And so that's kind of what evaporation is, or how that's happening. It's that energy colliding to the point where it gets knocked free, and then it brings that energy and the heat with them. And then when it turns into a gas and becomes freed into the air, or the gaseous form in space, it brings that thermal energy with it, and that's why air cools, right? So it doesn't stay warm when it's in the air. So if you think about steam, the higher up it gets, the cooler it's going to be once it gets up further, and that's because that thermal energy gets released and brought with the particles once it goes into the gas, which is kind of interesting to think about as well. So those are all ways in which a liquid can become a gas through vaporization. But then we can also think about condensation, which is a liquid, or sorry, a gas kind of turning into a liquid, which is interesting to talk about or think about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we can also think about liquids becoming solids. So the first thing that pops out to me is thinking about water turning into ice. And so kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, talking about the boiling point, when water hits its freezing point, water is going to turn into ice. And so what's kind of unique about this is that water actually expands when it's turning into ice. So the arrangement of the molecules actually separates further. So as those water molecules start to cool down, they slow down. So they're not moving as fast, right? That thermal energy is being lost. They're slowing down, they're cooling down, but the arrangement is actually expanding. And that's why if you put a full water bottle or something like a soda can in the freezer, it'll burst, right? Because they're usually full to the top. And when water freezes, it expands. So eventually that pressure is going to become strong enough to break whatever container it's in. And so that's why that happens. All right. So those are all different ways in which one state of matter can change into another state of matter physically, through the addition or the loss of some energy. And most of what I'm going to be talking about today is going to focus on forms of water, because it's really important, and it's one that's very important to the environment and to animals. So we are going to be talking about different states of matter related to water, which is the liquid form is water. The gas form of water is going to be water vapor. And so this is how much water is found in the air or in the atmosphere. And then the solid, right, would be ice. And so we'll talk about that more. Okay. So I have this picture in here. We've already talked about vaporization. We've talked about evaporation, but I have this picture in here of a whole lot of plants in a rainforest, because water is essential to plants, and it's going to play a big part in a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So it's very important. And so another way in which water can be transferred from one state of matter to another is through a process called transpiration, which is, kind of a form of evaporation that is specific to plants. And what that is essentially this idea that water is going to get pulled up from the ground. We know we have lots of water in the ground, in the soil. So plants are going to use their roots. They're going to pull water up through those roots, transfer it throughout the rest of the plant, up the stem, into the leaves. And then there are little holes or openings in the leaves of plants called stomata. And that's where water will be lost. And water will evaporate out of the leaves or out of those stomata in the leaves into the air. And so again, we've now transferred a liquid form of water in the ground through the plant and out the leaves as a gas. through the process of transpiration. So that's another way in which we can have a change in state of matter. But also really interesting to think about, and this is really important, is this is a water cycle as well, right? We're not only changing the state of that matter of water, we are also moving that matter from one environment to another, from the ground, let's say, up into the atmosphere. And so that's really interesting to think about. And so there are a lot of different features that can alter how fast transpiration is going to be happening and how fast evaporation is going to be happening. And those are all things like environmental conditions such as temperature and humidity and wind and exposure to sunlight. And so I want to briefly go over these different environmental conditions since we're talking about how the states of matter are relevant to our environment. And so I think it would be useful to talk about how these different environmental conditions are going to alter the process of water loss in an environment through evaporation and transpiration. And so the first to think about is temperature. So in general, how fast evaporation happens, which is the loss of water across any surface, whether it be across leaves in a plant through transpiration, right? Or even off the surface of a lake, how fast that evaporation occurs is going to depend on how warm or cold out it is. So in general, the warmer it is, the faster particles are going to be moving, the faster they're going to collide with each other and be released out into the environment. And so evaporation is going to happen faster when it is warmer. And also what's interesting to think about is temperature is related to humidity in a way, because the warmer air is, the more potential it is there is for the air to hold moisture. And so that's why when we talk about humidity, we often talk about relative humidity. So how moist the air is relative to how warm it is, because how much moisture the air can hold is going to be dependent on how warm it is. But the idea is that if it's warmer, the air can hold more moisture, which means there's more space for water to be brought into. And so if there's more space available, it's going to be easier for evaporation to occur because it's not going to be as hard to fill in that space if there's more available, right? You can think about that in terms of anything, if there's a wide open room, it's going to be a lot easier for a bunch of people to run into it. Whereas if the room is already packed, you're not going to be able to fit as many people in it. So it's going to be a lot harder and there's going to be, more of a struggle to fit more people in. So just in general, the more open it is, the more potential there is for more things to move in. So if it's warmer, that's another reason why evaporation is going to be able to occur more. And then humidity is again, a way to kind of document or study how much moisture is in the air. So not only if it's warmer, but if the relative humidity is lower, then that means there's more potential too for water to move in. So if there's not already a lot of water in the air, then there's going to be more potential for water to move into the air. So evaporation will increase too when there's less humidity present, or when humidity is lower. Okay, and then wind is interesting. Wind is also going to increase evaporation because what wind is going to do is it's just going to blow water molecules further away. And as the wind is removing water from a system or an environment or any given space, that's going to open up space for more water to come into it, right? So that's another way of reducing kind of how much water is present somewhere. And so again, if wind blows a bunch of the water out of the system, or moves those water particles away into a different area, then that opens up more space. And then lastly, light. This one's a little bit more related to transpiration and plants, but also in general. So light is going to warm up an area, right? So the more solar radiation there is, the warmer an area is going to be. And we know warmer environments allow for greater evaporation rates. But also plants use light for photosynthesis to make food. And so as they're photosynthesizing and moving food throughout the plant, they do that through water. And so the more water that's being used, the more transpiration is going to be occurring, and therefore water is going to be lost. All right, so that's why I have plants. Water is essential to plants for growth. They move water around. We all need plants because they are the base of all ecosystems, essentially as a food source, and also they produce oxygen as a byproduct of their photosynthesis. So we all need them to breathe. So they're very, very important because of that. And so I figured it would be relevant and necessary to include a picture of plants because water and plants are very strongly linked together. And we're going to see more of why that's true as we go through some of our examples. All right, and then we talked about condensation, right, which is, you know, the formation of water after things kind of cool down. And so the first example of this to kind of think about is when you go out in the morning and there's a bunch of dew on the ground. That's because things really cooled down and they condensed into water on the ground, right? Let's see. All right, so let's talk more about how changes in the state of matter can be relevant to different systems. So I included these two pictures here. The first thing that should jump off as a state of matter right off the bat is all of these wetlands. So this top picture, or actually both these pictures, are a landscape in the subarctic up in Canada. And so what you'll notice is there is a lot of wetlands on the surface of this landscape. And this is because there are actually two states of matter in the form of water in this picture, one of which is only visible, the other is not. Does anybody have an idea of what other state of matter is present that we can't see? Actually, there's three, sorry. There's three, we only see one. So the first one is the water, the liquid state of matter, which we see in all the wetlands. The second is there's water vapor in the air. This landscape is not, it doesn't have 0% humidity. So there's water vapor in the air in the form of a gas. So that's the second. And then the third is the tricky one that I was trying to ask about originally. There's a third state of water that we can't see in this picture, but is very present. Does anybody have any ideas as to what it might be? It's actually ice, and where it's found is underneath those wetlands. So in Arctic and in subarctic regions such as this one, there's something called permafrost, which is a solid and continuous layer of ice that in this landscape is found under the ground, and it's underlaying all of the ground. And so that's why these wetlands are all over the ground, because there's a solid blanket or sheet of ice underneath them. And if you think about it, if you dump a bunch of water in an ice bowl, that water's not going to go anywhere, right? It's going to sit in the ice because it's a solid. So essentially, that ice blanket or that permafrost under the ground prevents that water from draining anywhere, and it allows a lot of this landscape to be covered in wetlands. So it's really cool to think about. It's very important for this environment and this ecosystem to have that permafrost present because it allows all these wetlands to be present. And so it's kind of cool to think about that all three of those states of matter are found in this environment. But what's even more important to think about is the change from one state of matter to another and how that's actively happening all the time. And so unfortunately, one thing that's happening up in the subarctic is that temperatures are warming. And what I talked about earlier is that in warmer temperatures, there's more potential for evaporation. And so essentially there's concern that these wetlands are going to disappear because something else I should mention is that these wetlands are all very shallow. If you look closely at some of these wetlands at the bottom of the picture, you can almost tell, you can see the sandy color at the bottom of them. That's because all these wetlands are only about a meter deep at most. You can walk across half of them and only have the water go up to about your waist. And that's again because you can even feel the ice underneath you when you walk through some of these wetlands. You can feel the ice and that layer of ice below you. So one of the biggest concerns is that we're going to have the shift of one type of state of matter, which is that ice, melt into a liquid, which is more water. But what's going to happen is if that ice melts and it thaws out because of warming, then there's not going to be anything to hold these wetlands in place anymore. They're going to drain into the ground. We're going to have all that water start to drain or to flow, and some of these wetlands may be lost. So we have one shift of the state of matter from ice to liquid. Then, if temperatures keep warming, the wetlands themselves are going to lose water through evaporation right off the surface of them faster because of the warmer temps. So now we have liquid potentially shifting into a gas form, into water vapor through evaporation. And so those are some concerns. We want these wetlands in this environment. There's a lot of animals that use these shallow wetlands that are very important to them. And then the third thing that's going to increase water loss in this environment potentially and shift it from one state of matter to another is these trees. So what you're looking at here is things like spruce. And so what's kind of unique about this location as well, where these pictures are taken, is it falls kind of at the transition from where we have our forest. So you can see some trees are found in the forest, where we have our forest where there is not that permanent layer of ice, to the tundra. So the picture on top is more of a tundra landscape, which means there is that ice present layer. There's not a lot of vegetation. And so this area kind of falls at the transition from a forest to a tundra. But what happens is when that ice underneath the ground is lost, that allows trees to expand into that area. Because one of the limiting factor for those trees is their roots can't get deep enough to support the tree. They just hit the ice and they kind of get blocked out, right? But if that ice is leaving, then more trees are going to move in. And then what we were talking about earlier is plants will take moisture out of the ground, use that moisture, and then release it through their leaves, through those stomata. And that transpiration from plants is going to release more water from the ground in that liquid form as a gas. So between the warming allowing evaporation to just take more water off the surface of the lakes, it's also going to allow plants to move into the area and start to lose water through transpiration. And so all of this is possible because of the warming. And there's a number of different processes that contribute to this warming. And it happens a lot faster in northern regions, such as the subarctic, than it does here, such as in Georgia, where we are. So up north, warming occurs faster. And that's due to a number of different reasons, such as what we call feedback loops. So there's a number of different feedback loops that are allowing areas to warm up faster. And so one is really interesting because it's related to water in the gas form. And so essentially, if there's more humidity in the air and if there's more cloud cover, which is also, you know, where rain forms originally and water will drop out of that rain. If there's more water vapor in the air and cloud cover, that's gonna block some sun waves from releasing back into the environment. And instead of releasing back into the environment, it's gonna reflect them back towards the ground. And that's gonna warm the ground even more than just the normal sun rays coming in and warming up the ground, right? So when we see the sun out, if we feel the sun, it's warm, but that's the sun. Just think about that kind of being like the sun shining down on us. But then imagine instead of those rays getting released back out into the atmosphere, if they got blocked and came back down again on top of even more of the sun coming in, it really can just heat up an environment much faster. And so if that's happening, then the ground is warming more, there's going to be more evaporation, and you can just see how that's going to kind of feed back into a loop. But then what's really interesting to think about is there's another change in state of matter that's occurring in these environments, and that is this is an environment where polar bears are found, right? So this is the subarctic. And where do the polar bears like to be? They like to be out on the ice, that's sea ice. And so another trend that we're seeing is that each year or over the years, there's less and less sea ice or snow. So this picture was taken when I was there in the summer, and there's not snow covering the ground in the summer. This environment looks very different in the winter. We have water covering this entire landscape in the form of snow and ice. So that's kind of cool to think about too, is that this environment experiences very different conditions of water, or has very different states of matter of water depending on what the season is, because these pictures could be completely white if I took them during the winter. But what we're seeing is we're also seeing less snow and ice each year because it's warming up more. And so I was mentioning that in this environment, these pictures are taken, except for the frog in the top left-hand corner. That's not my picture. But these other two pictures were taken in the same environment. And so this frog is actually found in the subarctic, where I was taking these pictures, where I was saying there is snow and ice in the winter. So you might be thinking, how can a frog survive in an area that freezes completely and is covered in snow and ice in the subarctic? And it's because they do something pretty incredible. So I've been talking about shifts in the state of matter from one form to another. And what these wood frogs will actually do is they will freeze solid in the winter. So they are actually converting some of the water in their body. They are letting it freeze and form into a solid, which is ice, which is pretty incredible to think about, that this animal allows there to be a change in the state of matter in the form of water in their body, and they're still able to survive. And they're able to do that for a couple reasons. So the first is, before they freeze, they know their water in their body is going to freeze, just like us. We have a lot of water in our bodies, so do frogs. They move it to areas where it won't hurt them if it does freeze. So if you think about it, ice is little crystallizations, right? That can be sharp, but they don't want that ice to form in important organs or in their cells. So they actually move a lot of the water, not all of it, but they move a lot of the water into more open spaces in their body. So when it does freeze, it's not puncturing anything really important that couldn't be repaired. So pretty incredible that these animals can relocate the water in their body in anticipation or in preparation of their body freezing and turning into ice. And then in the spring, when temperatures warm back up, they actually thaw back out, and then they kind of they let that ice melt back into a liquid, which is water, and they thaw back out, and they'll just hop back out of the ground, and they'll go back into wetlands. So pretty cool. I thought it was really interesting to share an example of an animal that actually has a change in the state of matter within their own body, which is pretty incredible. Okay, and then the reason I have these pictures of these models here, these little frogs that look like they're red, is because these are made out of plaster, and I actually studied how much frogs can lose water. So I was talking about the change in the state of water in their body during the winter when it changes from water to ice. But what else is really important about amphibians is they can move water across their skin. They have really kind of porous skin where water can move. It's a thin layer of skin, and it's really wet. It's always wet, and that's because they're moving water in and out of their skin. And so they actually, kind of similar to we were talking about, plants can evaporate water, so can frogs and salamanders. They can lose water across our skin, just like a plant will lose water out of its leaves. And so them being in areas where they can pull water into their skin in order to counteract or balance out how much water they lose across their skin is very important for them. And similar to how I was talking about how wind and temperature and humidity is all going to impact how much water is lost in an environment, we also learned that all of those environmental conditions are going to impact how much water a frog loses through evaporation. And so we study what we call evaporative water loss rates in frogs. And so these frogs are a really good way to tell if water is being lost in an environment and how fast, and it's a really cool way to study them. And so essentially we placed these models out in the subarctic and throughout those like wetlands that I was showing you earlier, or even on the land and the grass in between those wetlands. And we wanted to know how fast they were going to lose water in this environment that's warming up. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about these frogs because there's lots relevant to these frogs that relates to our topic in terms of evaporation. And again, that change in state of matter from water to ice. Okay, moving on. So something a little bit different. Have you guys ever been, has anybody ever been outside in the morning kind of and seen a lot of fog rising up off of a wetland, such as this pond in this picture? It's pretty cool looking. It can look a little spooky, a little mysterious, but there's something very cool happening actually. And what that is this idea that depending on what season it is, water is really good at maintaining temperature. So water won't change temperature as fast as the air will. So throughout the day, we can have temperatures when we go outside in the morning, it can be in the 50s, right? And by the end of the day, it can be in the 70s. So we know air temperature can shift pretty fast, right? A water body that's large enough is not going to have temperatures shift that fast. They are going to maintain more stable temperatures. So they're not going to shift 20 degrees like the air can. And similar to that, land can shift temperatures more than water can. So water, out of the three things I just talked about, will hold more stable temperatures compared to land or air. And so what happens is, in the morning, the water will still be warm, right? But if cool air moves over the water will warm a really thin layer of the air that has moved over it and create a thin layer of warm air. But then what happens is, after that thin layer of air starts to combine with the colder air, it'll cool down. And remember, when water cools down, it slows down and it starts to pack the molecules more closely together, and it'll form into a more liquidy form. And that's why you'll see fog. So fog is the visible layer of water that's kind of condensed above the wetland, because the warmer air that has kind of evaporated, or the water that's evaporated out of the wetland, has moved into that warm layer of air, and then it combines with the cooler air and it makes it visible in a form of fog. So when you go out in the morning and you see that, and if you see kind of a spooky looking wetland, or I think it's really pretty at times, especially when the sun is shining on it, now you know why that's happening. It's because we're having shifts in states of matter from that water that's rising out of the wetland and combining and cooling down with the cooler air. So I thought that was really cool to talk about. You can also see this. This is not something that you can see just in wetlands. It's kind of similar to if you ever go for a run on a really cold day. When you're running, right, you heat up a lot, you sweat, and then what happens when you sweat? You have a layer of liquid on your skin, right? But you're also like losing moisture out of your body, right? And so you can actually even see sometimes steam coming off your body if it's cold enough outside and you went on a long enough run and you get hot enough. You can see even steam rising off of yourself, and it's the exact same effect as this. It's because it's, you're losing warm air, but then when it starts to cool down in the colder air, it'll become visible. So really cool. Thought I'd share that with everybody. And then the last thing I want to talk about is a really cool effect, or actually, I'm sorry, this isn't the last thing. One other thing I want to talk about is a really cool effect that's found in some areas that has a really important impact on environments and different types of habitats, is something called the rain shadow effect. So what you'll notice in both of these pictures is kind of a line in these landscapes where it shifts from green on one side to brown on the other side. So on the picture on the left, this is Hawaii. And then on the picture on the right, you have Chile on the left and Argentina on the right in South America. But either way, you'll notice that in the picture on the left in Hawaii, the top portion is green and the bottom portion is brown. And in the right portion, or on the right picture, the left portion is green, and you can see that desert habitat on the right where it's brown. But that line that breaks those two areas in both pictures is a mountain range. And so what happens is you will have wind carrying moisture towards a mountain range. And so this warm air closer to the ground, this warm, moist air is getting carried towards the mountain range. But what's going to happen is that air is going to have to move over the mountain range. So as it rises further and further up the mountain, it's going to start to cool down. And as it's cooling down, right, we've talked about this, it starts to condense. Those water molecules that are in the air, that water vapor starts to slow down. It's going to start to condense to the point where it's going to get high enough that clouds are going to form, and it's going to get so condensed that that water vapor has then formed into rain in those clouds, and it's going to drop rain. So what happened is we had a change from that gas form of water vapor into liquid form in rain. But what happens is all of that rain is going to fall before it can actually get over the top of the mountain. So the same side that it's traveling from initially, it's not going to actually make its way over the mountain. It's going to fall before it gets over the mountain. So only one side of the mountains and one land, or only one side of the land on the side of the mountains, is going to receive all of that rain. So if all of the rain is dumped on one side of the mountain and then the air finally moves over the other side, there's not going to be any moisture left, right? It already all got dumped in the form of rain. So then that other side isn't going to have any water available to it. And what it's going to do is it's going to form a bit of a desert-like habitat. And so this is just a really cool way to demonstrate how the change in state of matter from a gas to a water can have such a significant and important impact on environments. It's quite literally going to create a difference that is visible from an aerial view like this in these pictures, where you're going to have lots of vegetation and plants on one side of the mountain, on one side of the mountain range compared to on the other where there's no water available. You're not going to have a lot of plants. If you don't have a lot of plants, because remember we talked about earlier, plants need water for survival. We don't have a lot of plants, and we're not going to have a lot of animals, because plants are a big source of food for a lot of animals that need to be found in that environment. And you can just see how this can have such an important impact on the environment. Okay, and then lastly, let's talk about a type of wetland. So this is water, or it's the state of matter of water in liquid form, right? And I figured we'd talk about this one because it's a little bit more relevant to where we are in Georgia and in Florida. So this is a picture of a blue hole. It's a really unique kind of wetland that is a really deep hole in the ground. And they're important for a couple of different reasons. So the first is that remember earlier when I was talking about ponds and wetlands can retain somewhat stable temperatures. Well, these blue holes can do it at even a different level. They can actually maintain stable temperatures throughout the year. And so this animal on the right here is a manatee. And And even though they look really big and blubbery, they actually only have about an inch of blubber available to them to keep them warm. So they are pretty sensitive to what kind of temperature they can be found in, or what the water temperature that they're found in can be. And they don't like cold water, so they need to be in warm water year round. And so because these blue holes don't change temperature and they stay warm, it can be really important habitat for these manatees, and they will go there to kind of wait out colder temperatures that may be changing the temperature of water surrounding these blue holes. And because these blue holes remain warm and have good conditions, there's also lots of vegetation present again, right? And these manatees are herbivores and primarily feed on things like seagrass or other kinds of vegetation in the water. So not only will these blue holes provide the appropriate temperature that these manatees need, and they won't freeze over during the winter, they support grass and other vegetation in the water. It can be really important habitat for these manatees. And this is particularly important because they really are sensitive to temperature shifts. They can get something that's almost similar to like frostbite. You know how if you get really bad frostbite on your finger, something it can turn black and get really tough. Manatees can actually get, they can't get frostbite, but they can get something similar to that manatees can get. And so these blue holes are super important aquatic habitats, not just for manatees, but they have a lot of diversity in them. So a lot of plants and animals will rely on these types of habitats because they stay stable throughout the year. And so I thought that was a cool way to talk about a pretty unique type of wetland that's full of water, which is the state of matter we've been talking about throughout the day. And I figured we'd end on an example that's a little bit more relevant to an animal that relies on water and a type of aquatic habitat that's found a little bit closer to home. And so with that, I will take any questions. Let me see if I have any questions. I don't see any, but I hope you all learned something and found this interesting and kind of found it as cool as I did, how we can see actual changes in the state of matter within a single environment, and especially in the subarctic case, how we can have all three states of matter in the exact same area at the exact same time, but also how one state of matter can shift to another, and how that can be so important to even things like the animal that can change water forms within their own body, which was pretty incredible. So I hope you all found this interesting and learned something. And I hope you join us again in the future for some more cool talks. Take care, everybody.